In this screencast, I want to tell you a little story that I think will help to underscore the value of archaeology in studying the Bible as history, and also remind us that Scripture gives us um, uh, not only insight, but it has a level of integrity, of wholeness, of completeness. And so the story that I want to tell you begins with what we'll call the JEDP theory. Early at the turn of the century, into the 20th century, theologians and scholars were coming up with a way of trying to figure out what source material um, contributed to the formation of what we were calling the Pentateuch. There was becoming more and perhaps even widespread disbelief that Moses could have written such a thing. And so they began to look for other ways and other sources to look for signs of development in the text. And one of the ways that they did that was to deny the integrity of the text as a whole, but instead say that the Pentateuch comes from several different sources. One of them liked the name Yahweh, Jehovah, which is the J. Another liked the word Elohim for God. And so we see in the Pentateuch the use of both names. The idea came to them that perhaps because there are two names and perhaps more, that those are different writers and their works are being combined by later writers, combined by the Deuteronomist, who is not Moses, but somebody who lives way later. And then way post-exilic, there are a priestly faction who are then editing all of this work to bring about what we call today the Pentateuch. So that was the story that was given as to how the Pentateuch came to be. Its source material was not Moses, but instead coming from different authors and shaped over hundreds and even perhaps 1,000 years, shaped by others before it was passed down to us in the form that it is. So how would we show that was the true process, or how could we provide evidence against it? And here's where archaeology stepped in and gave us a big help. Meredith Kline and others were looking at some of the documents that were coming out of the ancient Near East. And they began to look at what we'll call Hittite Suzerain treaties. These were treaties that would date back even before the time of Moses. And so this particular kind of genre, we'll call it, the treaty genre, the kind of documentation that comes between an overlord king and a vassal king. So if you came in and you conquered my territory, you might choose to allow me to continue to be king over my own land, but I would then be subject to you. So I would send my taxes to you. I would give allegiance to you. If you went to war, I went to war on your side. If someone attacked me, you provided protection for me. I became a vassal king, and you were the overlord. So there would be a document, a treaty that would put together that would outline the relationship between you as conquering king and me as the vassal king. And these two kings would have certain different goals for that treaty. The suzerain king, of course, would want to maintain a relationship of submission. He doesn't want to be going to war all the time. So he wants, if he's going to leave me in charge as a vassal king, the overlord wants my submission, but he also wants peace. And so he's hoping to develop a relationship by which I will not just try to rearm myself in order to throw off his authority, but instead he will hope for putting together something that would maintain my submission, but also maintain peace. The vassal king then, who is the defeated king or some other smaller ruler, will be looking for in the relationship security, so that if he's a small king and he's already lost a war to the overlord, he doesn't want to be fighting all the time to try to maintain his own independence. If he can get the overlord to fight his battles, you see, he's in a much better shape. And so the vassal king is looking for security, for prosperity that can be handled by having a good relationship with the overlord. And the suzerain is looking to maintain peace as well, and the allegiance and the submission of those vassal kings. So they would put together these treaties, which were designed to inspire both submission and trust in the vassal. And these treaties had a particular kind of terminology. So when the overlord began to describe what needed to happen between the overlord and the vassal, he would use phrases like, know the king. So the idea is that the vassal king would acknowledge the rightful position of the overlord. But know wasn't the only one. There was one to fear the king. And this describes the allegiance and the reverence that was due to the overlord because of his position. And the ideal relationship was to love the king. The idea here is that animosity would be buried, and now what we would have is a vassal king who loved and trusted his overlord, gladly paid his debt in taxes to the overlord, and rejoiced in the fact that prosperity and peace was now coming both ways. So in these treaties, to use the word to know or to fear or to love was to describe the relationship that was expected or hoped for between the overlord and the vassal king. Is it starting to sound interestingly familiar? The treaties had a certain design to them, a certain outline. And so they would begin with a preamble. We would find out who the overlord was. We would find out who the vassal king was. And it would begin with an opening kind of praise for the power and the wisdom and the glory of that overlord. It would move then from the preamble to the historical perspective. The historical perspective would tell all the good things that the overlord had done for the vassal in the past. That would move on to rules and stipulations. Here's what the vassal is responsible for doing, and even some what the overlord would do. There are blessings if you respond in obedience to the overlord, and curses if you don't. And we will call the gods to witness this covenant, this treaty between us. And then when you pass off the scene, when I, the vassal, pass off the scene, what will be the succession arrangements? And so the goal is that this agreement, this new treaty of friendship, would last past the lives of the people who signed it and be passed on to the next generation. And lo and behold, what they found was that an outline of the book of Deuteronomy would easily follow those particular traits. In other words, the genre that encompasses Deuteronomy is actually put into a form of a international suzerainty treaty that Moses would have been familiar with, and God used to explain the ideal relationship between him as the ultimate overlord and the vassals who are the nation of Israel. Here's how it worked. So the preamble would be Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. You could look it up, in which you might see God as God praised for being the king, high and lifted up over his people. And then it would move on to the next section of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 1:6 through 4:49 describes what God has done for his people already. By the time Moses is writing to that next generation as they're poised to go into the promised land, Moses stops and explains the history of what God has been doing with Israel that has brought them to that point. Then there are rules and stipulations, and a lot of Deuteronomy contains those rules that God requires as the overlord for his nation, who are vassals under his authority. And then you have the passages that we would call blessings and curses. Blessings for obedience, curses for disobedience. And it's interesting, for a moment there, the passages are exact mirror, and you could check that out. These blessings and curses are designed to persuade Israel to keep the terms of their covenant with God. And that takes place in Deuteronomy 31 through 34. And then there are, at the end of Deuteronomy, succession arrangements, because Moses is going to pass on the power to a Joshua and then to the elders. And so Deuteronomy 31 through 34 indicates what God has planned for the succession arrangements of his law. Now you're probably asking, why did I start out? Oh, you might ask first, where are the witnesses, right? And there are no gods that we can call to witness a covenant between the God of Israel and Israel as God's people. Who could witness that? There really are no other gods. And so Moses writes that treaty with the natural world as the witness to the covenant. I call upon heaven and earth. You can see it in Deuteronomy chapter 4, and then you can see it in Deuteronomy 30 as well. So all the elements of a Hittite suzerain treaty are available to us in the book of Deuteronomy, both in the terminology of the relationship, in the witnesses, and in the structure of Deuteronomy itself. So now I'll take you back to our original question. If the documentary hypothesis was true, that over a process of almost 1,000 years, things were cut and pasted to put together a form that somebody post-exile would find favorable for the worship of Israel, does that seem more likely? Or does it seem more likely that a form of literature known to have been in use by the time Moses is around could be used to explain the relationship between God and his people? And do you see how genre trumps the cut and paste method of the documentary hypothesis? 1,000 years after the form that was known to Moses, it's much more likely that Moses used what he knew to be available to describe that ideal covenant between God and his people. It's an interesting archaeology story, and scripture comes out as much more integrated, much more whole as a result of what archaeology has to say.